Hey guys, it's Elise and welcome back to My Cupcake Addiction. Today we're going to be taking this simple traditional loaf tin and we're going to be turning it on its head to make an amazing giant size KitKat chunky slice. I'm going to turn this up a notch by adding a layer of thick, delicious, gooey caramel, turning it into a caramel KitKat slice. The things that you're going to need to make the caramel portion, I've got some whipping cream, which is cream with about a 35% milk fat, some water, I've got a little bit of butter, salted or unsalted, it really doesn't matter here, some caster sugar or superfine sugar. I've got some white chocolate and also some milk chocolate, a little bit of vanilla and some glucose. If you don't have glucose, you can also use like a light corn syrup or even honey for that. I've pre-prepared a batch of this caramel. It's actually something that I just showed you guys how to make in the giant Rolo video. So I will be showing you how to make it in this video, but I'm gonna do that part at the end, just in case you've already seen it so we can get to the good stuff. For the main part of my giant KitKat chunky, I am using this simple, humble wafer biscuit. You're also gonna need a ton of chocolate. I'm gonna melt that down, and if you're working with chocolate, you need to make sure that you're using a compound chocolate, which is chocolate that doesn't contain the ingredient cocoa butter. Of course, I've got my humble loaf tin, and I've made sure to choose one that's kind of got those nice rounded edges. You wanna make sure there's not too many scratches, so you don't want a really old loaf tin because they're all gonna show up on the outside of your loaf. And to make my little template so that we get the KitKat lettering today, I've cut up a cake box. I love this because it's already made from food grade cardboard, but on one side it's shiny, so we can decide which side we want to go into our chocolate so we get a nice shiny finish. And I've also got just a little KitKat logo, so I'll link to that down below, or you can print off your own. Let's get started. So this bit can be done in advance, and we're going to get a little bit industrial, so make sure that you're being really careful because you need to use either an X-Acto knife or a really, really sharp knife. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my piece of cake box, and you want to make sure that you're positioning on the rough side. So I'm going to lay my template over the top, and you can stick it with some tape if you like. And then I'm going to use a lot of pressure on my knife, and I'm just going to cut around that template. So I like to kind of cut out the main shape and then just come back in and just cut out the little tiny bits and details. I found it the easiest way. If you've cut hard enough, you should just be able to pop that letter out. And you can use your knife just to tidy up any edges or make sure that all of your corners release nicely. Once all of your little letters are cut out, I'm going to take a toothpick and I'm going to use a little bit of chocolate just to affix them to the bottom of my tin. This is kind of where it gets a little bit tricky. So we've cut it out on the rough side and you need to put it in backwards so that that smooth side is the one that's facing you. Position all of your letters before you start sticking them down to make sure that they're going to be in the center of your bar. When you're happy with your positioning, I'm going to use my toothpick and a little bit of melted milk chocolate, and I'm just going to use that to stick it to the top of my loaf tin. So onto the rough side goes my chocolate, and I'm just going to put a really small amount, just a little bit on the back, and then kind of spread it out a little bit, and then place it back down in its little designated spot, and repeat. Once your last letter's in place, you can use a clean toothpick just to go around the outside edges. You want these letters to be really neat. I'm pretty happy with that. That's ready to go. So now we're going to pour in some of our chocolate. The chocolate that I've used, like I said, is a milk compound chocolate, but I've also thinned mine out with either a little bit of Kofa or Crisco, and I'm going to completely cover that with more than I think I'm going to need, because then I'm going to give that a couple of good hard taps on the bench to make sure that it goes nicely onto those letters and in between all those cracks and grooves. Then I'm going to take a spatula and I'm going to spatula it right up the sides. Now I'm doing this now because I don't want to have any lines where I pour fresh chocolate onto this sort of top section of chocolate. Perfect. Once I'm happy with that, I'm just going to give it sort of a little shake and then another tap because I want that top section or the bottom section now to be as smooth as possible. And then I'm going to set that in the refrigerator for about 15 minutes until that's really nice and firm to touch. Coming back from the fridge, and that layer has now completely set. So I'm going to scoop a generous amount, and you can decide how much or how little caramel you want. And I'm just using my wooden spoon just to sort of smooth it out as best as I can so that it's one big, nice, even layer of caramel. Because I don't want that caramel to make my wafers go soggy and I don't want it drizzling down between my layers, I'm going to do another thin little layer of chocolate. So as I'm smoothing it, I'm making sure that I'm almost sealing it up against the edges of the chocolate that we poured in initially. Now while that chocolate's still wet, we're going to start layering our little wafer biscuits. I'm going to layer them nice up against as close to the end of my loaf tin as I can and as close together as I can. As I get to the end, I've got this little tiny section. So I'm just going to use a knife and just cut off like a little bit of one of my wafers. And I'm going to slide that piece in so it's really nice and flush. On goes just a really small amount more chocolate. So you've got something to glue the rest of your wafers to. And another layer of wafers. With this bar, it's actually very important that you make sure that you're leaving a little opening all around the outside edge because that's going to be where we pour in the rest of our chocolate. So if you're finding that your loaf tin's a little too narrow or a little too wide and you've got too much room, just trim some of those wafers down and kind of use them to fill in any of the spots. A little more chocolate and another layer of wafers. Unbelievable, that was the perfect fit. In goes the rest of my chocolate, and as I pour that in, I'm going to make sure that I'm pouring it around those edges and I'm letting it sort of drizzle into the cracks because I want to make sure that I'm not getting any air bubbles in there. I'm going to condone a couple of small gentle taps here, but don't go too crazy because like I said, we don't want to crack, but I'm just going to make sure that I'm forcing all of that chocolate right down into those little crevices. Once all of your edges are full, you can go ahead and just flood the top. You don't want to overfill here, but then you kind of want it to be just about even, so you don't want to underfill either. So I'm going to just use my spatula just to sort of even out once I'm happy I've got roughly the right amount of chocolate in there. And then I'm going to use my offset spatula. You could use a ruler or something here, but I just want to make sure that this bottom section's really, really nice and smooth. So I'm just going to drag along and then a couple of small taps to even it out. I'm just going to run a tissue right around those outside edges. I want to make sure that the edges are free and clear of the chocolate because it's going to make this easier to get out of the container, but it's also going to give you a neater finish around the bottom. And you definitely want to set this in the fridge because when the cool crispness of the fridge hits that chocolate, it's going to cause it to contract a little, which is going to help it to slip nice and easily out of our metal pan. Now, it should be nice and set. I've left mine in the fridge for around an hour or so. You can just very, very gently just sort of flex the metal away. I'm going to support the underside with my hands and I'm going to, it just popped out. Oh my God, perfect. So now all it's left to do is just to pull out our little letters and then we'll have that lovely KitKat lettering embossed in the top of our giant KitKat chunky bar. So I'm going to use my X-Acto knife and before I start prying up any of those letters, I'm just going to line around the outside edges to make sure that none of that chocolate we used to stick the lettering to the pan is coming around the outside that might cause any of my outside chocolate to crack and make those letters a little less than perfect. This is actually the most excruciating part. You want to do this really carefully. If you want to get rid of any excess, you could either use something like a really nice light brush, or I'm just going to use a tissue just to wipe away any little bits of chocolate flecks so that it's really nice and clean. Some spaces it didn't come out quite as neat as I would like, so I grabbed my hairdryer and put it on its lowest possible heat setting, hitting it with that hairdryer just ever so slightly, and don't go too crazy with the hairdryer there. On its lowest setting, just help to blend all of those pieces of lighter chocolate and darker chocolate back together and give it that smooth effect again. Let's get started on this no thermometer, gooey, thick, delicious, smooth caramel recipe. So I've got both of my pots heating up to their maximum temperature. In one pot, which is my larger saucepan, I've combined my water, my sugar, and my glucose. And in the other one, I've just got my cream. I wanted to make this as simple as possible so you guys won't need a candy thermometer, but you will need to watch very, very carefully. For my caramel portion, I've got a pastry brush, and as that even starts to heat up, I'm just gonna brush down the outside edges with a little bit of water, and this is just going to stop any sugar sticking to the outside sides of the bowl. I'm going to very, very quickly with a wooden spoon just give a very light stir, but I don't want to stir that too much once that caramel starts heating up. So while it's still in its cool state, it's okay to give it a little bit of a stir through, but if you stir it too much once it starts to heat, you're going to end up with grainy caramel. I've got some bubbles just starting to form in my pan, and so that I'm still kind of stirring it without actually stirring it, I'm just going to swoosh it a really little bit, just very, very gently, just to distribute the heat as evenly as possible so that I don't burn the caramel on the outside and not have it hot enough through the middle, just while everything heats up. My cream I'm watching because that's a sneaky one. It will go from not boiling to overboiling so incredibly quickly. Once my caramel starts boiling, I'm going to let that boil for 5 to 6 minutes. So you can set an alarm if you want, but you want to watch this like a hawk because it will start to change color. And as it changes color, that's when you're going to know it's time to pull it off. So you can see I've got a really nice bubble going on in my sugar mixture there, but it's still clear. So this is where we just watch it, and as it starts to turn color, we pull it off almost immediately, but I'll show you the different color stages. So at 2 minutes, your mixture should still be clear and it should have a really, really nice little rolling, bubbling boil going. At 3 minutes, we're still clear, so it doesn't look like anything's happening, but like I said, watch this sucker. My cream's just started to boil, so as soon as you see those bubbles, get it off the heat and pop it over onto something where it's not going to burn the bench. At 4 minutes, it's still clear, but you can see it's starting ever so slightly to take on a little bit of an amberish hue, and you'll notice it starts to smell quite sweet and delicious. At 5 minutes, we're still boiling. It's still relatively clear, but it's starting to thicken up. So you'll see that it's sort of reduced in size and it's getting thicker and thicker, those little bubbles. Once it thickens and those bubbles start to slow down a little bit, this is where the color change starts. It's always the most nerve-wracking part. At 6 minutes, we're still bubbling and boiling away. The color change is gonna happen any minute. While we're waiting for that, you can add your vanilla very quickly into your hot cream and just stir it through. It doesn't really matter when you do that, but after the cream is boiled is best so that it doesn't change the taste of the vanilla. So I'm at 7 minutes and you can start to see that color change happening. The amount of minutes is going to depend on the heat that you've got in your stove. I know on my induction, it only takes about 6. On this one, it's going to be a little bit closer to 8. So really you're going by color. You can see even as I'm speaking, it's getting more and more golden. Those bubbles have slowed right down. They're still definitely bubbling away. I've got a beautiful honey yellow color happening at the moment, so I'm going to let it get a little bit deeper. You sort of want the color of a light cup of tea. At 7 minutes and 20 seconds, still honey, but it is definitely deepening. And you'll notice I haven't been stirring it at all, and I also stopped wiping down the outside edges once that sauce started to thicken. Once it starts to thicken, the water's actually going to cause it to splatter. So you only want to wipe down around the outside edges with your pastry brush while it's reducing, about the first 4 minutes. We're so close. It's getting more and more golden. Still not quite where I want it. I'm going to give mine a very, very quick swoosh just because even looking at it, I can see it's slightly more golden around the outside edges, and I want to make sure that it's coloring as evenly as possible. You want to get it to just that beautiful, kind of like a light cup of tea or an iced tea sort of a color. As soon as it's at that color, take it off the heat and we're going to pour in the cream. Now the reason this cream's hot is because otherwise it would bubble and splatter everywhere. I'll give it a quick stir just to make sure I don't have any of those little skim bits of fat on top, and then in it goes. Little bit at a time because it is going to bubble up, kind of like a bit of a science experiment. Stirring it around as I add it to make sure that sugar doesn't crystallize. Make sure that I've got no lumps. It smells incredible. So while your caramel's still nice and hot, but it's stopped bubbling and broiling, you can add in your butter. Be really careful it doesn't splash up and hit you there. And then you just want to stir that until that butter's completely melted. I like to keep the butter cool because it helps to cool down the caramel a little bit faster. And so that we're not waiting all day for this caramel to cool down, I've actually put some ice and some water into a metal container. And I've got another metal bowl. I'm going to use that as a bit of an ice bath, and it's going to cool our caramel down in about 1/8 of the time. So once that butter's all stirred through, I'm going to let it cool down a little bit, and then we're going to add in our chocolates, which as they set back up, are going to help to give our caramel a little bit of additional thickness and a little bit more sweetness. My butter's completely dissolved, so I'm going to pour that into my metal bowl. And I'm using metal just because it will conduct the cool a little bit better, but it will also conduct the heat, so make sure that you don't now grab it by the base, which is still going to be incredibly hot. I'm just going to carefully pick it up by the very, very top and rest it into my ice bath. Whenever you're using an ice bath, you want to make sure that the caramel on the bottom doesn't get really hard and the stuff on the top's not quite cool yet. So you just stir it around, not continuously, just intermittently as it cools. And I'm going to give that about 3 minutes over the ice bath before I add the chocolate. This is super hot and I don't want to burn the chocolate as I add it because that's going to cause the chocolate to kind of get a little bit grainy and it's going to make the texture of your caramel not as smooth and creamy as we'd like. Okay, so my 3 minutes is up and I'm going to pour in that white and milk chocolate. For a lighter caramel, you could use all white, but I didn't want mine to be too sweet, and white chocolate can sometimes be overly sweet, so I wanted to balance it out with the milk. I'm just going to stir that around still over that ice bath until that chocolate's completely melted. And you'll see that instantly start to thicken up, both as the chocolate melts and as the caramel starts to cool a little bit. With most caramels, they will thicken up quite a bit on cooling. So it's sort of tough because you know what consistency you want to achieve, but you can't see it until well after you've actually finished making the caramel. Ever since I first saw the regular KitKat caramel chunkies on supermarket shelves, it's been one of my favorite candy bars, and I cannot tell you how excited I was to be able to recreate this today in giant form. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure you do for 2 new videos every week. As always, guys, thanks very much for watching.